Take a look at this map. It shows the GDP of Italy by region, in other words, the value of all goods and services produced in the country. Now look at the unemployment rate map. And here's a map of income levels. Notice the difference? This is how any map of Italy looks. It's as if someone carefully drew a line between two different countries. Yet it's still one country, right? The North lives at the level of France or Germany. The South feels more like Argentina. In the North, you have brands, businesses, international corporations. In the South, it's agriculture, mafia, and emigration. And all this exists within one country with one capital and government. There's no other example like this in Europe, and this regional divide has existed for centuries. People often say that Italy is two countries under one flag. Why did it turn out this way? Is it true that Napoleon accidentally inspired Italians to unite? Why do Northerners and Southerners often struggle to understand each other? Why did the Mafia appear specifically in the South? And how did a country with no common language or identity manage to unite? We all know that Italy looks like a boot on the map, but few people know that at the beginning of the 19th century, such a country didn't even exist. By historical standards, it appeared on the map relatively recently. In fact, the Levi's company was founded earlier. The word Italy itself was first used by the Greeks to describe the southern part of the Apennine Peninsula. In Europe, as the Austrian diplomat Clemens von Metternich once said, it was considered merely a geographical expression. Despite its wonderful climate, this territory also had one big weakness for those times: a very long coastline. Yes, that meant opportunities for trade, but it also made sea invasions much easier. And while the Alps in the north acted as a natural barrier, they couldn't stop everyone. So, the people living in Italy were faced with a choice: either wait for the next enemy to attack or strike first. And that's how the Roman Empire was born, an empire that, at its peak, stretched from Britain to Egypt. However, the triumph of the empire was followed by its fall, and when Rome collapsed, Italy fragmented into a patchwork of tiny states, each with its own rulers, laws, and currencies. This division turned Italy into an easy target for foreign powers. The Spanish, the Arabs, the Normans, the Franks. The list of invaders goes on. The peninsula became a battleground for endless wars. Because of all this, there was no single Italian identity until the 19th century. The people of Italy were incredibly diverse in culture and customs, even in how they spoke. In fact, Italians didn't even share a common language. At the time, there were more than 30 different dialects from Sicilian to Venetian. Modern standard Italian language had to be created. The Florentine language dialect, which became its foundation, was chosen because it was the language of the so-called Three Crowns: the poets Dante Alighieri, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Francesco Petrarca. Even today, Italy remains Europe's champion in the number of regional dialects. You could say that back then the people from different parts of the peninsula had almost nothing in common. Even if someone had wanted to unify Italy back then, geography would have made it nearly impossible. Yes, Italy is a country of stunning landscapes, but that beauty also made unification incredibly difficult. Getting into Italy was easy, but moving within the country not so much. The Alps in the north separate Italy from the rest of Europe, while the Apennines stretch along the entire peninsula. And although the Apennines aren't the tallest mountains, they created natural barriers isolating entire regions. People in neighboring villages might not have known anything about each other. That's how Italy became a patchwork of regions, each one developing its own unique way of life, often totally different from the next. And this is where the first deep differences between North and South began to take shape. In this sense, the South was less fortunate when it came to geography and climate. It's hot, dry, and the soil is less fertile. Mountains make travel and agriculture harder, and on top of that, there are active volcanoes like Vesuvius and Etna. You've probably heard of Pompeii, the city destroyed by Vesuvius in 79 AD. While the North was opening new opportunities, people in the South were dealing with natural disasters. But geography isn't the only reason for the divide. For centuries, the South was under foreign control. First the Romans, the Greeks, Muslims, Normans, the Spanish. For a long time, the region was ruled by the Kingdom of Naples, a kingdom whose economy, let's just say, was far from thriving. It relied heavily on religion, discouraged education, and preserved a feudal land system where only the elites held power. But out of these hardships, a unique culture was born. Family, faith, and tradition became the pillars of Southern life. At the same time, those same conditions gave rise to something darker, the Sicilian Mafia. As a result, the South suffered greatly, falling behind economically, trapped for generations under feudal rule and foreign domination. But what about the North? In contrast, the north of Italy owes much of its success to geography. Most of the region is covered by the Po Valley, the largest plain in the country nourished by the Po River and its many tributaries. You can probably guess what that means. Surrounded by the Alps, this fertile land was perfect for agriculture. The river provided irrigation and, just as importantly, easy transport routes for trade. These conditions laid the foundation for slow but steady economic growth. Yes, northern Italy was under Austrian control for a time, but their rule brought laws, order, and investment in infrastructure. Even long before the Austrians, as early as the 12th century, this fertile land had already given rise to powerful trading city-states: Venice, Genoa, and Milan. Venice dominated Mediterranean trade, Genoa connected Europe with the East, and Milan thrived on land-based commerce. All this wealth and trade triggered a cultural explosion. Universities like the University of Bologna were established, literacy rates increased, banks like the Medici banks emerged, industries developed, architecture, cities, all began to flourish. Education and commerce pushed the North forward economically, and this progress continued for centuries. But now you might be wondering, if North and South were so different, how did Italy ever manage to unify after all? Everything changed with Napoleon Bonaparte. It all began with the Napoleonic Wars when in 1796 Napoleon invaded northern Italy. But instead of keeping things the way they were, he completely redrew the political map of the peninsula. Dozens of small kingdoms disappeared, and in their place he created 3 large states. Did he do this out of love for the Italian people? Of course not. It was for his own convenience. It was easier to manage a few large territories than dozens of tiny ones. But Napoleon didn't stop at redrawing borders. He brought with him the ideals of the French Revolution and started implementing them in Italian life: a constitution, equality before the law, parliamentary principles. All of this was brand new for a country that had lived under feudal traditions for centuries. He reformed civil and criminal law, built roads and bridges, and for the first time, Italians saw a glimpse of what their peninsula could be. Not just a patchwork of territories, but something more unified with shared laws and no foreign rulers. Of course, Napoleon's empire didn't last forever. After his defeat, everything was rolled back. Italy once again became a mosaic of small states, many of them under Austrian control. It seemed like things had returned to the old ways, but there was one problem. The ideas Napoleon had planted didn't disappear. The northern elites in particular couldn't forget what they had seen. They began to understand that unity and freedom weren't just abstract dreams. They were real possibilities. Napoleon was the one who broke the old traditions of division and breathed into Italy a new spirit of change. That spirit of change burned brightest in the north, especially in the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. And it's from there that Italy's unification would finally begin. But why there exactly? Because after Napoleon's defeat, most Italian states went back to their old ways: feudal rule, censorship, foreign control. But Piedmont-Sardinia was different. It kept its constitution. Free trade continued, industry began to grow, factories and railways were built, and the military grew stronger. In short, it was the most modern, progressive, and prepared state in Italy, and that's why the unification started there. At first, a few of Piedmont's neighboring states voluntarily joined it, seeking protection from Austrian dominance. While they fought in the north, a movement called the Risorgimento was rising across the country. Italians were awakening, dreaming of freedom and unity. And the hero of this dream was Giuseppe Garibaldi, a sailor and soon a legend. In 1860, Garibaldi landed in Sicily with just 1,000 men, conquered the island, and then took Naples. Later, even the Papal States, which had long divided the peninsula from coast to coast, also joined the kingdom. And just like that, in 1861, the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia officially unified Italy. Ironically, after the unification of Italy, the divide between north and south didn't shrink. It actually got worse. The new government focused its efforts on developing the north, where the Industrial Revolution was already underway. Meanwhile, the South was largely left behind, still dependent on agriculture with widespread poverty. Just to give you an idea, in 1859, the northern regions had 2,316 kilometers of railway, while the southern regions had only 184 kilometers. The gap was undeniable. Since the North led the unification and attracted most of the wealth, it set the rules. For example, the former Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia even raised taxes for Southerners, which only made things worse and slowed any chance of development. Even Massimo d'Azeglio, one of the founding fathers of the New Italy, famously said, "We have made Italy, now we must make Italians." After all, the country didn't even have a common dialect. It was around this time that the Mafia began to emerge, and it's no coincidence that it happened in the South. The economic divide had left the South in deep poverty. With little opportunity, frequent droughts, and a future tied to backbreaking farm labor, many young people turned to crime. Centuries of foreign rule had killed any trust in the law. Authority was always seen as something imposed and unfair. When Italy was unified, Rome became the new capital. But for Sicilians, it felt no different from the foreign powers that came before. Taxes were sent north, and in return the South received almost nothing. There weren't enough police, especially not in remote villages, to maintain order or provide protection. People stopped believing in courts and official laws, and in that vacuum of trust, a new set of rules began to take root. What followed was the rise of local clans, groups that originally protected farmers from bandits. But over time, these clans became the power. They started making their own laws, collecting their own taxes, and deciding what justice looked like. Thus, the Mafia thrived, filling the gaps where the state was absent. In the end, you could say that what Italy lacked was order. There was deep-rooted corruption, and ordinary people had zero trust in the government. Then came World War I, and instead of solving anything, it only made things worse. Even though Italy was technically on the winning side, it gained almost nothing from the victory. The public grew increasingly frustrated, to high taxes, corrupt officials, no meaningful reforms. People were tired. They wanted someone strong, someone who could fix it all. And that's when Benito Mussolini appeared. He knew how to speak to the masses. He founded the Fascist Party, promising to restore order and bring back the glory of Italy's past, invoking the names of Garibaldi and the Roman Empire. His dream of a new empire soon pushed Mussolini into an alliance with Hitler. And that same dream of greatness turned into a catastrophe. Although Italy wasn't divided after World War II like Germany, the country was left in ruins. That's when the United States and its allies realized something important. Rebuilding Europe wasn't just a humanitarian mission, it was also a way to stop the spread of communism. Italy, at the time weak and vulnerable, could easily have become a target for Soviet influence. So, under the Marshall Plan, European countries, including Italy, began receiving massive amounts of aid and loans. And where does that money go first? Naturally, to rebuild industry in Italy's case, to the north, it created a kind of vicious cycle. Investments flowed into the north to restore industry that led to economic growth. Southerners migrated to the north for work, which brought even more growth. New companies were born, infrastructure was restored, and wealth increased. As a result, the regional gap widened even more. Now, it's not like the South was completely ignored. There were special programs, government subsidies, New roads and schools were built and tourism started to grow, but still the starting conditions were too different, and that made equal development almost impossible. On top of that, the South continued to struggle with distrust of the government, a traditional way of life, corruption, and the Mafia. But even all these challenges didn't stop Italy from achieving its economic miracle. Italy became one of the world's top economies. It joined NATO, was one of the founding members of the European Union, and it was the third largest economy in the bloc. And yet, even after all that progress, the North remains more developed. The problem that began long ago still exists today, and Italians are still trying to solve it. In Italian politics, there's even a name for it, the Southern Question, referring to unemployment, corruption, and the lack of investment in the South. The North is often seen as the engine of the country. It's home to major industries, financial centers, innovation, business, science, and culture. However, many northern regions are frustrated that they have to support the weaker and more corrupt southern provinces. Meanwhile, the South is still largely focused on agriculture and tourism. It has much higher unemployment and lower average incomes. Southerners in turn blame the government and the wealthy North for neglecting their problems. But it's important to understand, the South is not in collapse. Even its economic indicators lower than the North, they are still comparable to countries like Argentina or Turkey. Yes, salaries are lower, but so are expenses compared to northern regions. The real issue is that within the context of one of Europe's largest economies, the contrast between North and South feels impossible to ignore. And yet, it's exactly these contrasts that make Italy unique. Its history is a clear example of how geography and centuries of foreign rule can shape internal divisions that don't just vanish over time. The Southern Question remains one of the key issues in Italian politics, and the gap in living standards between regions is still significant. But despite the tensions between North and South, Italy values its unity and national identity. Italians are proud of their history, culture, and language. And all the differences within the country only make it richer and more fascinating. Because despite everything, Italy remains one. Not perfect, but authentic. What do you think? Will Italy ever overcome this North-South divide? And if you've been to Italy, did you notice the differences yourself? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe.